"You were never the wife I needed, Duchess, and this house will be better without your weakness." The words fell across the Ashcombe ballroom like a blade laid upon a table. Duchess Evelyn Ashcombe stood beneath the crystal chandelier, with one gloved hand resting against the edge of a marble pillar, while dozens of titled guests watched her humiliation unfold. The winter evening had begun with music, silver trays, and polite laughter. It ended with the entire room listening to her husband, the Duke of Ashcombe, announce that his own wife had become an embarrassment to his name. The Duke, Edmund Ashcombe, stood beside the fireplace with a calm expression that made the cruelty sharper. He did not shout. He did not need to. His silence between each sentence allowed every guest to understand the accusation. He claimed Evelyn had become unstable after years of disappointment. He claimed she had imagined insults where none existed. He claimed her sorrow after the loss of their only child had made her unable to manage the responsibilities of a duchess. A few ladies lowered their eyes. Others smiled behind their fans. There were whispers, there were small laughs, and Evelyn understood the most painful truth of that night. They were not laughing because they believed Edmund. They were laughing because believing him was easier. The Duke lifted a small leather notebook from his hand and placed it on the table before the guests. "This belonged to my wife," he said. "It contains the thoughts of a woman who no longer understands reality." The room became still, not because they felt pity, because they wanted to see the evidence of a fallen duchess. But none of them knew that the little diary hidden inside that worn leather cover would reveal a truth powerful enough to shake Ashcombe from its foundations. And none of them knew that the woman they had allowed to be abandoned that night would return carrying the one thing they could never take from her, the truth. If you are listening to this story, tell us where you are joining from today. If you enjoy tales of forgotten voices, hidden family secrets, and justice finally reaching those who were wronged, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications so you never miss a new story. Your support, whether through a kind comment or sharing this tale with someone else, helps these stories continue to be heard. Now let us return to the beginning, to the winter when Evelyn Ashcombe lost her place among the people who once called her family. 3 years earlier, before the whispers and the accusations, Evelyn had entered Ashcombe Manor as a young duchess who still believed kindness could survive inside a noble house. The estate stood among the cold hills of the English countryside, its stone walls dark beneath the winter rain. The servants knew every crack in the old corridors. The gardeners knew which trees had survived storms. The family portraits knew more secrets than the living people who passed beneath them. Evelyn had never been foolish about wealth. She understood that a duchess was not simply a wife, she was a symbol. She represented the dignity of the family name, the generosity of the household, and the careful appearance of perfection expected by society. But she believed marriage was also meant to contain trust. Edmund had once seemed to believe the same. When they first married, he had written her letters filled with affection. He had walked with her through the gardens at Ashcombe Manor. He had listened when she spoke about improving the conditions of the servants and creating a small school for village children. It was not a grand dream. It was not a political ambition. It was simply a woman wanting the people around her to suffer less. But after the death of Edmund's father, everything changed. The new duke inherited not only the title, but also the pressure of maintaining a great estate. Money became a constant subject behind closed doors. The family accounts grew more complicated. The old expectations of nobility became heavier. And into that pressure stepped Lady Araminta Ashcombe, Edmund's aunt, a woman whose voice was always gentle and whose intentions were rarely so. Araminta believed Ashcombe needed stronger control. She believed Evelyn was too emotional. She believed a duchess should not concern herself with servants, villagers, or charity when the family fortune needed protection. Most importantly, she believed Evelyn had become an obstacle. Because Evelyn had no living son. In the eyes of many families of that era, a daughter could bring affection, but a son brought security. A daughter could inherit memories, but a son carried the family line. The cruelty was never spoken directly at first. It arrived through small comments. A question about whether Evelyn felt lonely. A suggestion that perhaps she needed more rest. A remark that the household required someone with a firmer hand. Then came the night when everything shifted. At a dinner held in Ashcombe Manor, while guests admired the chandelier above them and the servants moved silently with carefully arranged plates, Edmund announced that Evelyn would no longer oversee household decisions. He said it was temporary. He said it was for her own comfort, but everyone understood what it meant. Her authority was being removed. The next morning, the changes began. Her correspondence was delivered later than before. Invitations were no longer shown to her first. The housekeeper, who had once asked for her advice, began waiting for instructions from Araminta instead. Evelyn noticed. She always noticed. She simply refused to create a scene. That was what made people misunderstand her. They believed quiet meant weakness. It did not. It meant she was watching. During those months, Evelyn spent long evenings in the library beside the fire, reviewing household records that Edmund assumed she would never question. She discovered that several payments from the estate accounts did not match the explanations given by the steward. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. Money moved away from repairs. Money moved away from tenant assistance. Money moved toward private arrangements approved by Edmund and Araminta. Evelyn did not immediately accuse anyone. She knew accusations from a woman were often treated as emotional complaints. She needed something stronger. She needed proof. One evening, while searching through an old locked cabinet in the library, she found a small wooden box hidden behind several account books. The key was missing. But inside the cabinet was a folded piece of paper with a name written halfway across it. A solicitor's name. The rest of the sentence had been torn away. Evelyn held the paper near the candlelight and studied the faded ink. Someone had hidden something, and someone had been afraid enough to remove the rest. The following day, she asked the elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Whitmore, about the paper. The old servant became unusually quiet. She looked toward the corridor before answering. That small movement told Evelyn more than words could. Mrs. Whitmore had served Ashcombe for 40 years. She had seen marriages celebrated, funerals held, and arguments buried beneath expensive carpets. She knew which doors opened, and which doors were never meant to be touched. There was something about the old Duke's final months, Mrs. Whitmore finally admitted. Something written. Something Edmund did not want found. Before Evelyn could ask more, footsteps approached. The conversation ended, but the suspicion remained. The house had begun speaking, and Evelyn had finally learned how to listen. The final blow came 6 months later. A letter arrived from London informing Edmund that several influential families had begun questioning Evelyn's health. The rumors had spread, not quickly, carefully. Someone had prepared them. Someone had told society what to think before Evelyn ever had the chance to defend herself. The accusation was not that she had committed a crime. It was worse. They suggested she could not be trusted. For a woman of rank, reputation was another form of property, and someone was trying to take hers. On the evening of the winter ball, Evelyn entered the room believing Edmund wanted a private discussion. Instead, she found a crowd. Instead, she found judgment. Instead, she found her husband holding her diary. She had written in that diary during the darkest nights of her marriage. Not dramatic declarations, not wild accusations, simple observations, dates, names, memories. She recorded conversations because she feared one day people would claim they had never happened. She recorded kindness because she feared one day she would forget that kindness had existed. And now, Edmund held those pages as if they were proof of her failure. After the announcement in the ballroom, Araminta approached Evelyn with a cold smile. "You should leave quietly," she said. The words were soft. The meaning was not. Evelyn looked around the room. The same people who had praised her charity now watched her fall. The same people who had admired her grace now waited for her shame. She felt the cold air enter whenever the ballroom doors opened. The warmth of the fire belonged to others. For the first time in her life, Evelyn understood what it meant to become a stranger inside her own home. But she also noticed something. A servant standing near the doorway, an old man who had served the Ashcombe family before Edmund was born, Mr. Hale. He was looking not at her with pity, but with fear, as if he knew the diary contained something far more dangerous than personal sadness. That night, Evelyn was forced to leave Ashcombe Manor through the servants' entrance, the same entrance used by people whose names were never spoken at dinner. She carried only a small case, a few dresses, a small amount of money, and a memory of Mr. Hale silently placing something into her hand before she stepped into the rain. A small key. The key to the box hidden in the library. Evelyn did not know what waited inside. She only knew one thing. Someone had risked everything to help her find it. And as the carriage disappeared into the storm beyond Ashcombe Manor, the woman everyone believed had lost everything carried the first piece of the truth with her. But she did not yet know that the diary her husband used to destroy her would become the very thing that brought the Ashcombe family to its knees. The carriage carried Evelyn away from the only home she had known as rain, struck the windows in thin, endless lines. The road beyond Ashcombe Manor disappeared into darkness, and for the first time since she had become a duchess, no servant opened a door for her, no carriage waited, because of her title, and no one asked where she wished to go. She was simply a woman traveling through the night. The realization wounded her more deeply than she expected. Not because she missed the luxury, she missed the certainty. She had spent years believing that loyalty, patience, and devotion could protect a person from cruelty. She had believed that if she behaved with dignity, others would eventually recognize the truth. But the world outside Ashcombe had already decided who she was. A troubled duchess, a fragile wife, a woman who had lost her mind. Evelyn closed her eyes as the carriage moved toward the nearest village. She did not cry. She had cried before. She had cried when her child died. She had cried when Edmund stopped speaking to her as a husband and began speaking to her as a problem. She had cried alone in the library while the fire burned low. But this night was different. This was the first night she understood that grief could either bury a person or sharpen them, and she chose to remain standing. The carriage stopped near a small village inn where the owner, Mrs. Bell, looked surprised to see a woman of Evelyn's appearance arrive without servants or luggage. The inn was nothing like Ashcombe Manor. There were no marble floors, no portraits, no servants waiting with silver trays. There was only a warm fire, wooden furniture, and the smell of fresh bread from the kitchen. For the first time in many years, nobody looked at Evelyn because of her title. They looked at her because she was a person standing in front of them. Mrs. Bell did not ask unnecessary questions. She simply prepared a small room upstairs. That kindness almost broke Evelyn more than cruelty had, because she realized how rare simple kindness had become. The next morning, Evelyn opened the small case she had brought from Ashcombe. Inside were only a few personal items: a handkerchief embroidered by her mother, a small prayer book, a few letters, and the key from Mr. Hale. She held it tightly. The old servant had not spoken a single word when he placed it into her hand. But his eyes had said enough. He knew, someone at Ashcombe knew, and perhaps others had known all along. The first time in her life, Evelyn began searching for answers not as a duchess defending her reputation, but as a woman fighting to reclaim her own story. 2 days later, she returned to the village, near Ashcombe Manor, not to enter the estate. Not yet. She knew that would be impossible. Instead, she went to the small market where former servants and estate workers often gathered. The place was alive with ordinary conversations, farmers discussing harvests, women trading cloth, children carrying baskets, people who had never attended a grand ball but understood the truth of life better than those who had. There, Evelyn found Mrs. Whitmore's niece, Clara, a young seamstress who had once delivered messages between the manor and the village. Clara recognized her immediately. "Your Grace." Evelyn raised a finger gently. "Not here." The young woman looked around and lowered her voice. "I thought they had taken everything from you." "They tried," Evelyn answered. The words surprised even herself. Not because they were angry, because they were certain. Clara hesitated before revealing something she had been afraid to say. After the old Duke died, she had seen Lord Edmund and Lady Araminta arguing in the library. They were discussing papers, not ordinary papers, documents that had to be changed before anyone outside the family saw them. Evelyn felt her heart tighten. "Did you hear what papers?" Clara shook her head. "But I heard one name, your father's solicitor, the same name she had seen written on the torn paper. The missing piece of the mystery had moved closer, but not close enough." That evening, Evelyn returned to the inn and began a new habit. She worked, not because she needed money immediately, because she needed independence. The first time in her life, she learned what it meant to earn something without a family name attached. She began helping Mrs. Bell organize the inn accounts. The numbers were simple compared with estate management, but the work gave her something Ashcombe had taken away: control. She discovered that she had a talent for organization. She understood payments, supplies, waste, small details others ignored. The woman they called incapable had been managing complex household matters for years. They simply refused to acknowledge it. Meanwhile, inside Ashcombe Manor, Edmund believed he had won. He told guests that Evelyn had gone away to rest. He allowed rumors to continue. He accepted sympathy from people who praised his patience as a husband. But something troubled him. The diary. He had read it many times. At first, he believed it would destroy her. But the more he examined the pages, the more uncomfortable he became. Because Evelyn had written carefully. She had not written wild accusations. She had recorded dates, meetings, conversations, names. Every detail was written with the calm precision of someone preparing for a future she feared would come. One evening, Edmund sat alone in the library while the fire burned beside him. The diary lay open before him. For the first time, he wondered whether he had made a mistake. Not a mistake in anger, not a mistake of emotion, a mistake of judgment. He had believed Evelyn was too gentle to fight. He had mistaken restraint for surrender. And somewhere beneath his pride, a quiet fear began to grow. Because if even half of what she recorded was true, then the person he had tried to silence was the only person who could expose them. 3 weeks after Evelyn left, a storm stronger than any before struck the countryside. The roads became difficult, travel slowed, letters arrived late, and in that delay, secrets began moving. One night, Evelyn sat beside the inn fireplace when a knock came at the door. She expected a traveller seeking shelter. Instead, she found Mr. Hale standing outside, soaked from the rain. The old servant looked older than he had only weeks before. He removed his hat. "Your Grace." Evelyn immediately brought him inside. "You left Ashcombe knowing what they would do to me." The old man lowered his eyes. "I knew what they intended. There was a difference." Silence filled the room, not the silence of fear, the silence of two people carrying the same burden. Mr. Hale reached inside his coat and removed a folded piece of paper. "I could not save your position. I could not stop the rumors, but I kept this." Evelyn unfolded it carefully. It was a copy of an entry from the old estate records. A payment made shortly before her father-in-law's death, and beneath it was a note referring to a trust that should never have disappeared. Her hands trembled, not from weakness, from understanding. The truth was no longer a feeling. It was becoming evidence. Mr. Hale looked toward the window where rain continued to strike the glass. "There is something else," he said. "Something I heard the night before you left." Evelyn looked at him. "What?" The old servant swallowed. "Lady Araminta said the diary would be enough to convince everyone. But Lord Edmund asked whether the original papers had truly been destroyed." The room became still, because suddenly Evelyn understood. The diary was not the weapon. It was the warning. Someone had been afraid of what else she might find. And somewhere inside Ashcombe Manor, hidden behind locked doors and carefully guarded names, the real secret was still waiting. For the first time since leaving her home, Evelyn allowed herself a small moment of hope. Not because she believed justice came easily, not because she believed the powerful would willingly admit they were wrong, but because she finally understood something important. They had not removed her from the story. They had only given her the distance needed to discover the ending. The following morning, Evelyn did not return to Ashcombe Manor. Not yet. The old version of herself would have rushed back with the paper in her hands. She would have demanded answers. She would have believed that the truth, once spoken aloud, would force everyone to recognize it. But the woman who had walked through the servants' entrance in the rain was no longer the same woman sitting beside the inn fire. She had learned something painful. Truth without preparation could be buried. Truth without witnesses could be called madness. And truth without protection could be taken from the person brave enough to speak it. So Evelyn remained in the village. She continued helping Mrs. Bell with the inn accounts during the day. She repaired torn clothing for travelers in the evenings. She listened carefully to conversations in the market, not searching for gossip, but for patterns. For the first time in her life, she understood the value of being unseen. At Ashcombe Manor, everyone watched the Duchess. At the village inn, nobody cared who she had been. They cared whether she balanced the accounts correctly, whether she treated people fairly, whether she kept her word. The first time in her life, Evelyn discovered that respect could exist without a title. It was a quiet discovery, but it changed her. Meanwhile, the situation inside Ashcombe Manor began to shift. Edmund had expected Evelyn's disappearance to make everything easier. Instead, her absence created questions. Guests who once attended every gathering began declining invitations. Letters that once arrived every morning became fewer. The same society that had laughed in the ballroom now waited to see which way the wind would turn. Reputation among the upper class was fragile. It was not built only on wealth. It was built on the belief that a person deserved admiration, and Edmund was beginning to lose that belief. Lady Araminta noticed before he did. "You are allowing uncertainty to spread," she told him one evening in the library. Edmund looked up from the estate papers. "I have done exactly what was necessary. Have you?" The question irritated him. For years he had accepted Araminta's advice because she always spoke with confidence. But confidence was not the same as honesty. He looked toward the locked cabinet where his father's old documents had once been stored. Something had bothered him since Evelyn left. Not the rumors, not the scandal, the diary. He remembered reading one passage again and again. Evelyn had written about a conversation between Edmund and his father shortly before the old Duke died. She had recorded the exact date, the exact location, the exact words she remembered hearing through the half-open library door. At the time, Edmund dismissed it. He thought she had misunderstood. But now another memory returned. His father had been angry that night, not at Evelyn, at him. And he had mentioned something about responsibility, something about protecting what belonged to the future. Edmund had ignored it, because ignoring uncomfortable truths was easier than facing them. The first time in years, Edmund wondered whether he had chosen the easier path because he was afraid of the harder one. Days passed, then weeks, and Evelyn continued building a life away from Ashcombe. She began keeping her own account book, every coin earned, every expense, every favor exchanged. It was not a grand achievement compared with managing a duchy, but it was hers. She understood now that independence was not always created through dramatic victories. Sometimes it began with a small room, a simple ledger, and the decision to stand again. One afternoon, while reviewing supplies for the inn, she noticed a mistake in a merchant's invoice. The error was small, but it would have cost Mrs. Bell several pounds. When Evelyn pointed it out, the merchant looked surprised. "Most people simply sign what they are given," he said. Evelyn closed the ledger. "That is how mistakes become permanent." The merchant had no answer. Later that evening, Mrs. Bell smiled as she watched Evelyn work. "You know, my lady," she said carefully, "you are not the first noble person to lose a house." Evelyn looked up. Mrs. Bell continued, "But you may be the first one I have seen who gained herself afterward." The words stayed with Evelyn, because they were not comfort. They were recognition. A few days later, Mr. Hale returned. This time, he brought another person, a thin, elderly man carrying a worn leather folder. Evelyn recognized him immediately, the former solicitor's clerk. He had worked for Edmund's father many years earlier. "I should have spoken sooner," the man said. Evelyn did not answer immediately. She had learned that apologies were easy. Actions were what mattered. Why now? The old clerk looked down. "Because I saw what happened to you, and because I remembered what happened before." He opened the folder. Inside were copies of old correspondence. Letters between the former Duke and his solicitor. The papers did not reveal everything, but they revealed enough. The old Duke had created arrangements to protect Evelyn's future after his son's death. He had worried that Edmund might be pressured by others. He had specifically written that Evelyn's position as Duchess should never be removed through false claims or manipulation. Evelyn read the words slowly, not because she doubted them, because she understood what they meant. Her husband had not simply abandoned her. He had betrayed a promise made before she ever knew there was a promise to protect. But then she found something else. A letter dated shortly before the old Duke's death. The handwriting was different. The tone was urgent. It mentioned a meeting, a revised document, and one person's name, Lady Araminta. Evelyn looked up. She did not feel satisfaction. She felt sadness, because the truth was becoming clearer. This was not a simple disagreement between a husband and wife. It was a family willing to sacrifice one person to preserve an illusion, and she had been chosen because they believed she would remain silent. The following week, a formal invitation arrived at the village inn, not from Edmund, from the Countess of a neighbouring estate, a gathering in London. A private evening where several influential families would attend. Evelyn understood immediately. Someone was trying to control the story before it spread further. Perhaps Edmund wanted to repair his reputation. Perhaps Araminta wanted to challenge her publicly. Either way, they were opening the door. And this time, Evelyn would walk through it prepared. That night, she returned to the small room above the inn. The diary lay beside the new documents. For months, it had represented pain, a record of every moment she felt ignored, every insult she swallowed, every fear she refused to admit. But now she saw it differently. It was not a diary of weakness, it was a record of survival. She placed the old diary beside the evidence gathered from the solicitor's clerk, the personal truth and the legal truth, together. Outside, the storm continued across the countryside, but Evelyn no longer felt trapped by it. She had spent years standing inside warm rooms while her heart froze. Now she stood outside in the cold and discovered she could still endure. The journey back to Ashcombe had not begun with a carriage. It had begun with a decision, and when Evelyn finally returned to the world that had rejected her, she would not return as the woman they had dismissed. She would return as the woman who had learned exactly how powerful her voice could become. But she still did not know that Edmund Ashcombe had found another hidden letter of his own, and that its contents would force him to choose between protecting his title or finally facing the truth. Edmund Ashcombe found the letter hidden behind the old wooden panel in his father's library, 3 days before Evelyn was expected to return to London. He had not been searching for it. That was what troubled him most. The letter had been discovered by accident, after he ordered the shelves moved so the cabinet could be repaired. A loose piece of wood had fallen away, revealing a narrow space behind the wall. A space someone had intentionally created. Inside was a single envelope. The paper had aged, but the handwriting remained clear. His father's handwriting. Edmund stood alone in the library as the fire burned low. For several minutes, he did not open it. The room that had once represented authority now felt like a place where every shadow carried a forgotten accusation. Finally, he broke the seal. The letter was not long. It was not filled with anger. That made it worse. His father had written with disappointment, not hatred. Edmund, if you are reading this, then I fear the decisions I warned you against have already begun. A title is not protected by removing those who speak uncomfortable truths. A family is not preserved by sacrificing the innocent. Edmund lowered the paper. His hands had become still. He continued reading. Your wife, Evelyn, has shown more understanding of Ashcombe than many born into privilege. If circumstances ever force you to choose between the appearance of strength and the honesty of your actions, choose honesty. A duke may survive losing approval. He cannot survive losing his integrity. The words remained in the air, not because Edmund had never heard such ideas before, because he had spent years avoiding them. He remembered Evelyn standing beside him during the early years of their marriage. He remembered her concern for the estate workers. He remembered her asking questions about the accounts when others simply accepted what they were told. He had once admired that. Then he had allowed others to convince him that admiration was weakness. The letter continued. I have prepared documents that will protect Evelyn should anyone attempt to remove her rights unfairly. They are held with my solicitor. They are not a challenge to you, Edmund. They are a reminder that power without responsibility becomes nothing more than selfishness. Edmund closed his eyes. For the first time, he understood the true cruelty of what had happened. He had not merely believed a lie. He had helped build it. The door opened. Lady Araminta entered without waiting for permission. "You look troubled." Edmund folded the letter immediately. "Do you know about this?" Her expression changed slightly, only for a moment, but it was enough. She knew. That small hesitation revealed more than any confession. Araminta walked toward the desk. "Whatever you have found, Edmund, remember what is at stake. The Ashcombe name, the estate, your position." Edmund looked at her. "And Evelyn." Araminta remained silent. That silence answered him. The room became still. Not the silence of politeness, the silence of a truth finally reaching the person who had refused to see it. "You knew," Edmund said quietly. Araminta lifted her chin. "I knew what was necessary." "No." Edmund shook his head. For years, he had allowed others to define the situation. A difficult wife, a fragile woman, a family problem. But now the words sounded different. "You decided what was necessary because you wanted control." Araminta's expression hardened. "Careful, Edmund. You are speaking about matters beyond your understanding." He looked down at the letter. "Perhaps, but I am beginning to understand them now." For the first time, Araminta appeared uncertain. Because Edmund was no longer defending his title, he was questioning it. Meanwhile, in London, Evelyn arrived at the gathering arranged by the Countess. She did not arrive with a grand entrance. She did not seek attention. She entered quietly, wearing a simple but elegant dark blue dress, carrying a small leather folder containing copies of the evidence she had collected. Several guests turned immediately. Some looked surprised, others looked uncomfortable. They had expected a broken woman. Instead, they saw someone composed, someone who had endured humiliation and returned without bitterness. The same people who had watched her fall now watched her stand. The first time in her life, Evelyn entered a room filled with powerful people without needing their approval. That was the difference. Before, she had entered as someone hoping to belong. Now, she entered as someone who already belonged to herself. The gathering began with polite conversation. But beneath the smiles, everyone waited. They wanted to know whether the rumors were true. They wanted to know whether the former Duchess would defend herself. Evelyn did not rush. She understood something now. A person who controls the timing controls the story. Then a messenger arrived. A letter for Duchess Evelyn Ashcombe. The room noticed. Even those pretending not to watch looked toward her. She opened it carefully. The handwriting was familiar. Edmund's. Inside were only a few lines. "I have found what my father left behind. I believe I owe you the truth." Evelyn read the words twice, not because she trusted them immediately. Trust was not rebuilt by a sentence. It was rebuilt by action, but she felt something she had not expected. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Something quieter, the possibility that the man who had abandoned her might finally be forced to see what he had done. That evening, Evelyn met with the former solicitor's clerk again. They organized the evidence, the diary, the account records, the letters, the testimony. Each piece had its place, each piece connected to another. The story that had been used against her was beginning to collapse. But the final step would not happen in a private room. It would happen where the humiliation had begun, among the same people who had laughed, at the same kind of gathering, before the same society that had accepted the easiest version of the truth. 3 days later, an invitation arrived from Ashcombe Manor, a winter gathering. A formal evening. Edmund had requested her presence. Evelyn held the invitation beside the fire. Once, that name had represented everything she feared losing. Now, it represented something else, a place where the truth would finally be spoken. She looked toward the window. The storm clouds were gathering again over the countryside, but this time she would not be leaving through the servants' entrance. This time, she would walk through the front doors, and everyone inside would have to decide whether they were prepared to witness the woman they had abandoned reclaim her voice. The morning before the gathering, Evelyn returned briefly to the small village inn where her journey had begun. She stood beside the wooden table where she had first opened the key from Mr. Hale and looked at the simple ledger she had kept during her time away. From Ashcombe. The pages were not decorated with a family crest. They contained no grand titles, only work, only effort, only proof that she had survived without the protection of a name. Mrs. Bell watched her quietly from the doorway. "Are you afraid to return?" Evelyn closed the ledger. Yes. The honest answer surprised them both. She had once believed courage meant feeling no fear. Now she understood better. Courage was walking forward while fear remained. Mrs. Bell smiled faintly. "Then you are ready." Before leaving, Evelyn placed the ledger carefully beside her other documents. She did not take it as evidence against anyone. She took it as a reminder. The woman entering Ashcombe Manor was not the same woman who had been forced to leave. That woman had been searching for justice. This woman had already begun building a life beyond the reach of those who tried to destroy her. As the carriage prepared to depart, Mr. Hale approached with one final message. "A letter has arrived from the estate steward," he said. Evelyn looked at him. "What does it say?" The old servant hesitated. "The family accounts have been requested for review." A small silence followed. Not because the words were surprising, because they confirmed what Evelyn already knew. The walls of Ashcombe Manor were beginning to reveal what had been hidden inside them. She took the letter and placed it with the others. Then she stepped into the carriage. The road ahead was cold. The sky was heavy with winter rain. But for the first time since she had left Ashcombe, Evelyn was not travelling away from something. She was travelling toward the truth. The carriage reached Ashcombe Manor just as evening settled over the countryside. The great stone walls stood exactly as Evelyn remembered them. The same windows, the same iron gates, the same long path leading toward the entrance. But the feeling was different. Once, those gates had represented belonging. Now, they represented a question. Could a place that had rejected her ever become a place where truth was allowed to exist? The carriage stopped. The footman opened the door. For a moment, Evelyn remained seated. She remembered the night she had left, the rain, the servants' entrance, the whispers behind curtains, the feeling of carrying a whole lifetime inside one small case. But that memory no longer controlled her. She stepped onto the gravel path, not as a woman asking permission to return, as a woman who had come to finish what had been started. Inside the manor, preparations for the gathering were already underway. The ballroom had been restored to its usual appearance. Candles burned along the walls. The chandelier reflected warm light across polished surfaces. Servants moved carefully, carrying trays and arranging the room with practiced precision. But beneath the elegance was tension. Everyone knew something unusual was about to happen. The guests had arrived, expecting another explanation from the Duke. They expected Edmund to control the evening. They expected Evelyn to defend herself. They did not expect the possibility that the entire story might change. When Evelyn entered the ballroom, conversation stopped. The silence spread from one person to another. Some guests looked away. Some stared openly. A few offered small greetings, uncertain whether they should apologize or pretend nothing had happened. Evelyn acknowledged them with calm courtesy. She did not punish them with anger. She did not reward them with forgiveness. She simply refused to become smaller for their comfort. Across the room, Edmund saw her. For several seconds, he did not move, because the woman standing before him was familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. She still had the same gentle expression, the same careful manners, but the uncertainty he had once seen in her was gone. He approached slowly. "Evelyn." His voice was quieter than she remembered. She inclined her head. "Your Grace." The title between them felt colder than it had ever felt, not because she used it as an insult, because it reminded them both of the distance created by his choices. Edmund looked toward the guests. "There are things that must be explained." Evelyn held his gaze. "Then explain them, not to me, to everyone who heard the accusation." The words were not loud, but the room heard them. Edmund looked around. The same society that had watched him condemn her now waited for him to answer. For once, he could not hide behind private conversations and carefully chosen statements. He nodded slowly. "That is fair." Lady Araminta, standing near the fireplace, immediately stepped forward. "Edmund, perhaps this is not the appropriate moment." He turned toward her. "No." The firmness in his voice surprised everyone. "It is exactly the appropriate moment." Araminta's expression changed, only slightly. But Evelyn noticed. The woman who had controlled every conversation at Ashcombe was suddenly uncertain. Edmund walked toward the center of the room. The fire crackled behind him. No one spoke. "I owe an apology to my wife." The statement alone caused a reaction, not because apologies were rare, because powerful men rarely admitted fault in front of witnesses. Edmund continued, "I believed protecting Ashcombe meant protecting its appearance. I was wrong." A few guests exchanged looks. The Duke continued, "I allowed rumors to replace truth. I allowed assumptions to replace evidence. And I allowed someone I should have protected to stand alone." Evelyn listened carefully. She did not interrupt, because this was not the end. It was only the beginning. Edmund turned toward her. "But I know an apology cannot repair what was done." No, it could not. The answer existed silently between them. Then the former solicitor's clerk stepped forward. The elderly man had remained near the back of the room until now. Many guests barely noticed him. That was his advantage. For years, people like him carried information while those with titles carried authority. He bowed. "Your Grace." Edmund looked at him. "You have something to present?" The clerk opened the leather folder. "I have documents concerning the late Duke's instructions regarding the Ashcombe estate and the protection of Duchess Evelyn's position." A murmur moved through the room. Lady Araminta's face changed completely. "Stop this." Her voice was sharper now. The calm mask had cracked. The clerk looked toward Edmund. "My lord, these documents were preserved after the late Duke's death. They were never destroyed." Edmund turned toward Araminta. "Never destroyed?" She did not answer. That silence was enough. The room understood. Evelyn remained still. She had imagined this moment many times. She had imagined anger. She had imagined satisfaction. But standing there, she felt something else. Relief, because the burden of proving her own sanity was finally leaving her shoulders. The clerk presented the documents. The old letters, the estate records, the evidence of the arrangements made before Edmund's decisions. Then Mr. Hale stepped forward. His voice trembled slightly, but he spoke. "I saw the changes made after the old Duke's death. I remained silent because I feared losing my position." A servant admitting fear before nobles was not common, but his honesty carried weight, because it was not a performance, it was a confession. Evelyn looked at him with gratitude, not because he had saved her, he had not, no single person had. But because he had finally chosen truth over comfort. The room remained silent, not the silence of embarrassment, the silence of people realizing they had been wrong. Lady Araminta looked around. She searched for someone to support her. No one moved. The same doors that had once opened for her now seemed distant. The same invitations that had once arrived without effort now carried uncertainty. Her power had never been as permanent as she believed. It had depended on everyone believing her, and belief was disappearing. Edmund looked at Evelyn. There was regret in his expression. Real regret. But Evelyn knew regret was only the beginning. The damage remained. The years remained. The loneliness remained. A person could be forgiven. But the past could not simply be erased. And as the final document was placed upon the table, Evelyn saw the last missing piece of the truth. A signature, a decision, a choice made years earlier that proved exactly who had been trying to control Ashcombe all along. But before she could speak, Lady Araminta made one final move that threatened to change everything. She stepped forward with a small envelope in her hand. The confidence had returned to her face, not the confidence of someone certain of victory, the confidence of someone who had found one last door to escape through. Before anyone could stop her, she raised the envelope. "There is another matter that must be considered." Edmund looked at her carefully. "What is that?" Araminta did not answer him immediately. Instead, she turned toward the guests. "You are all prepared to believe that Evelyn was wronged because a few old papers have appeared. But are we truly willing to destroy a family name based on incomplete information?" Her voice carried through the ballroom. It was the same skill she had always possessed, turning uncertainty into suspicion. For years, she had not needed to prove herself innocent. She only needed to make others doubt the person accusing her. Evelyn watched her quietly. Once that tactic would have frightened her. Once, she would have searched the faces around the room and wondered who believed the lie. But not anymore. She had spent months in a small village where people judged her by her actions, not her title. She had learned something important. A person who depends entirely on doubt has already lost when the truth becomes clear. Araminta opened the envelope. Inside was a letter supposedly written by the late Duke. This, she said, was also found among the family papers. Several guests leaned forward. Edmund's expression changed, because he recognized the handwriting, or at least, he thought he did. The letter suggested that the old Duke had concerns about Evelyn. It suggested that he questioned her judgment. It suggested that he feared she was too sentimental to protect Ashcombe. For a brief moment, uncertainty returned. The room shifted, not because they believed Araminta completely, but because they had been trained to expect another secret. Evelyn looked at the paper. Then she looked at the clerk. The elderly man had gone pale. "You know this letter?" Edmund asked him. The clerk stepped closer. "I know the paper, not the contents." A small pause followed, and then he continued, "Because this is not the original." Araminta's expression hardened. "That is an accusation." "No." The clerk shook his head. "It is an observation." He carefully examined the document. "The paper is from a later supply. The late Duke used a different stationery for private instructions." The room became quiet. The clerk reached into his folder. "And there is another detail." He removed a small sample from the old records. The seal on this letter was copied. Not used, copied. The accusation did not collapse with a dramatic shout. It collapsed through patience, through small details, through the kind of truth that could not be defeated by confidence. Edmund looked at Araminta. For the first time, he did not see the aunt who had guided him. He saw the person who had helped him abandon his wife. "You forged this?" His voice was low. Araminta lifted her chin. "I protected this family." "No." Edmund's answer came immediately. "You protected yourself." The words struck harder than anger, because they came from the person whose approval she had relied on for years. The room remained silent. Not the silence of curiosity, the silence of judgment. Araminta looked toward Evelyn. "You think you have won?" Evelyn met her eyes. "I did not come here to win." The answer surprised everyone. "I came here because the truth deserved to be heard." Araminta gave a bitter smile. "And what will you do now?" Evelyn looked around the ballroom, at the people who had laughed, at the people who had remained silent, at the people who had watched without asking questions. Then she looked back at Edmund. "I will decide my own life." The simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any accusation, because for years others had decided everything for her. Her reputation, her place, her future, but that ended tonight. Later, after the guests had begun leaving, Evelyn walked alone through the corridor that led toward the library. The same corridor where she had once searched for answers and found only locked doors. This time, the doors were open. The library fire burned warmly. Edmund stood beside the desk. For a moment, neither spoke. There were too many years between them, too many words left unsaid. "I should have believed you," Edmund finally said. Evelyn looked at him. "Yes." A simple answer. A painful answer. He lowered his eyes. "I cannot change what I did." "No, but you can choose what you do next." Edmund nodded slowly. The first time in his life, he understood that responsibility was not about protecting a title. It was about accepting the consequences of having one. Outside, the winter storm began to fade. The rain that had once carried Evelyn away from Ashcombe now fell softly against the windows of the home she had nearly lost forever. But she knew something had changed. She could return to the estate. She could reclaim her position. She could accept Edmund's apology. Or she could walk away and build a different future. For the first time, the choice belonged entirely to her. And that was the freedom no one in Ashcombe Manor had ever been able to take away. The following morning, Evelyn woke before sunrise. For years, she had measured mornings by the duties waiting for her as a duchess. Letters to answer, guests to receive, decisions to approve. Expectations fulfill. But this morning was different. No one waited for her instructions. No one questioned her choices. No one watched her for signs of weakness. She sat beside the window of the room that had once belonged to her and looked across the estate grounds. The snow from the night before had covered the gardens in a quiet white layer. She remembered walking there years earlier with Edmund, when they still believed they understood each other. The memory hurt, but it no longer controlled her. The first time in her life, Evelyn allowed herself to remember the past, without wanting to return to it. A knock came at the door. It was Mrs. Whitmore. The old housekeeper entered carrying a small wooden box. "I believe this belongs to you, Your Grace." Evelyn looked at the box. She recognized it immediately, the same box she had searched for in the library months earlier, the box that had started her search for the truth. "How did you find it?" Mrs. Whitmore smiled sadly. "It was never truly lost. It was simply hidden where no one thought to look." Evelyn opened the box. Inside were several letters, a small collection of notes, and one final page from her old diary. Not the pages Edmund had shown in the ballroom, a page he had never seen. Evelyn read the handwriting slowly. It was written during the earliest months of her marriage. She had forgotten the entry. She had written about hope, about believing that even powerful people could choose kindness. For a moment, she felt the sadness of the woman she had been. A woman who had entered Ashcombe with trust, a woman who had given love before. She understood how easily love could be used against her. Mrs. Whitmore watched her carefully. "You were always trying to save this family." Evelyn closed the diary. "No." She paused. "I was trying to believe this family could save itself." The distinction mattered, because she finally understood that she had spent years carrying a responsibility that was never hers alone. Later that afternoon, Edmund came to the library. He did not arrive as a duke giving orders. He arrived as a man asking permission to enter. There was no audience, no guests, no servants listening behind doors, only two people facing the consequences of what had happened. "I have spoken with the solicitor," he said. "The accounts will be reviewed. The changes made after my father's death will be examined properly." Evelyn nodded. "And Lady Araminta?" Edmund looked toward the fire. "She will leave Ashcombe." The answer was calm, not cruel. "She will lose the influence she used to control this house. The family connections she relied upon are already changing." Evelyn studied his face. She could see the regret, but she could also see something else: understanding. For the first time, Edmund was experiencing the cost of choosing comfort over truth. "I do not expect you to forgive me," he said. Evelyn remained silent, because forgiveness was not a gift that could be demanded. It was something earned slowly. "Perhaps one day," she answered. "Perhaps not." Edmund accepted the answer. That was the first honest thing between them in a very long time. A week later, Evelyn returned to the village, not because she had been rejected by Ashcombe, because she chose to go. The difference was something only she understood. She continued helping Mrs. Bell with the inn accounts. She continued supporting the village families who had once known her not as a duchess, but as a woman who worked beside them. The people there welcomed her without hesitation. Children who once avoided speaking to her now greeted her by name. Merchants who once lowered their voices around her now asked her advice. She had lost a title for a time, but she had gained something far rarer, a place where she was valued without needing to prove she deserved it. Months later, when Evelyn returned to Ashcombe Manor for another gathering, the same ballroom looked different. The chandelier still hung above. The polished floors still reflected the candlelight, but the room no longer held power over her. The people inside were no longer judges, they were witnesses. And when Evelyn entered, no one laughed, no one whispered, no one looked at her as a woman who had fallen. They looked at her as a woman who had endured. Edmund stood near the entrance. He did not reach for her hand. He did not pretend everything had been repaired. He simply bowed, a gesture of respect, a gesture he should have given years earlier. Evelyn returned the gesture, not as a defeated wife, not as a forgotten duchess, but as Evelyn Ashcombe, a woman who had lost a home and discovered herself. And as the evening continued, the old diary rested safely inside the library cabinet, not hidden, not locked away, placed where anyone could find it. Because some truths did not need protection forever. They only needed one person brave enough to open the page. Because some truths did not need protection forever. They only needed one person brave enough to open the page. Years of silence had once lived inside Ashcombe Manor. Now, slowly, the house began to change, not through grand declarations, not through a single evening of apology, but through small decisions made when no one was watching. The servants noticed first. The instructions around the estate became different. The old habits of fear began to disappear. The housekeeper no longer waited nervously before speaking. The workers were consulted about repairs. The accounts were reviewed openly. It was not perfection. Ashcombe was still an old house carrying old traditions. But for the first time in many years, the people inside it felt that truth had a place there. Evelyn returned often between the village and the estate. She did not return because she needed Ashcombe. She returned because she had chosen what parts of her past she wished to keep. That choice belonged only to her. One winter afternoon, she walked through the gardens where she had once felt like a stranger. The trees stood bare. The wind moved gently through the branches. She remembered the night she had left, the cold road, the heavy rain, the fear that everything meaningful had been taken from her. But standing there now, she understood something she could never have understood then. Loss had not only removed things from her life, it had revealed what could never be taken: her judgment, her compassion, her ability to begin again. Edmund found her there near the old stone path. He stopped several steps away. He had learned not to enter her space without being invited. "There was a time," he said quietly, "when I thought losing control of this house meant losing everything." Evelyn looked toward the garden. "And now?" He looked at the manor behind them. "Now I understand that a house is only stone and wood. A family is built by what people choose to protect." The answer was simple, but it carried the weight of years. Evelyn did not immediately respond. She had spent too long accepting words without actions. But she saw the difference now. Edmund was not asking her to forget. He was not asking her to return to the woman she had been. He was finally acknowledging the woman she had become. There were still wounds between them. Some wounds did not disappear because the truth was revealed. Some apologies arrived after the damage had already been done. But healing did not always mean returning to the past. Sometimes it meant creating something different from what had existed before. That spring, Evelyn opened a small room near the village market, where women could learn accounting, sewing, and household management. Some members of society questioned it. They said a duchess should concern herself with more elegant matters. Evelyn simply continued, because she knew the value of practical knowledge. She knew what happened when people were denied the ability to understand their own circumstances. The same woman once accused of being incapable now taught others how to protect themselves. The irony was not lost on those who remembered the ballroom. The people who had laughed the loudest were now the people who spoke of her courage. But Evelyn never needed their admiration again. She had already discovered something far more valuable: peace. One evening, while the sun disappeared behind the fields near Ashcombe, Evelyn returned to the library. The diary remained inside the cabinet. She opened it one final time. The pages no longer felt like evidence of suffering. They were proof that she had survived every moment she thought she could not survive. At the final blank page, she wrote a new entry. Not about Edmund. Not about Araminta. Not about the people who had tried to define her. She wrote about the woman who had walked through the storm and continued forward. The woman who had learned that dignity was not something granted by a title, it was something carried within. And when the next winter arrived, the people of Ashcombe gathered again beneath the chandelier. But this time, there was no accusation, no hidden plan, no cruel laughter, only conversation, only music, only the quiet understanding that the woman standing among them had once been pushed away and had returned stronger than anyone expected. The old ballroom, or Leor, or Lobot, Lorum, Lorum, Lara, Loris, 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 Lor. Sometimes, justice was the moment when the wounded person no longer needed the approval of those who caused the wound, and Evelyn Ashcombe had finally reached that moment. A person's worth is not measured by the doors that close against them, but by the strength with which they build a new path. If this story of Evelyn's journey touched your heart, remember to like, subscribe, and support the channel so more forgotten voices can be heard. The words of support faded into the quiet warmth of Ashcombe Manor. But Evelyn's journey did not truly end with the return of her reputation. A reputation could be restored. A name could be respected again. But trust was something built more slowly. In the months that followed, Evelyn discovered that the hardest part was not facing those who had wronged her. It was learning how to live without expecting betrayal. For years, every closed door had made her wonder what was being hidden from her. Every whispered conversation had made her question whether she was the subject. Every silence had felt like a warning. Now, when she walked through Ashcombe's corridors, she had to remind herself that not every shadow concealed a secret. One afternoon, while reviewing the accounts of the village school she had helped establish, a young woman approached her. She was the daughter of a tenant farmer. Years earlier, Evelyn had helped her family during a difficult winter, though the girl had barely understood who had offered the assistance. Now she stood before Evelyn holding a small notebook. "I wanted to thank you, Your Grace." Evelyn smiled gently. "For what?" The young woman looked down at the notebook. "For teaching me that knowing things matters. My father always said, people like us should simply accept what we are given. But you showed us that understanding the world is the first step toward changing our place in it." Evelyn looked at the notebook in the girl's hands. She remembered the same feeling, the helplessness of not knowing, the fear created when other people controlled the information. She had once been defeated not because she lacked intelligence. She had been defeated because others believed she had no right to question. Now she made certain fewer people lived under that same assumption. The first time in her life, Evelyn realized that her suffering had not become meaningless. Not because suffering was necessary, but because she had chosen what to do with what remained. Later that year, another letter arrived at Ashcombe Manor. This one was from Lady Araminta. No one expected it. After leaving the estate, Araminta had withdrawn from society. Invitations that once arrived regularly had become rare. The circles where she once held influence had closed their doors one by one. The letter was brief. There was no excuse, no attempt to rewrite the past. Only an admission. "I spent many years believing control was the same as protection. I was wrong." Evelyn read the letter beside the library fire. She read it twice. Not because she was searching for hidden meaning, because she was trying to understand the person who had caused so much damage. She felt no desire for revenge. The woman who had left Ashcombe in the storm might have wanted to see Araminta suffer. But the woman sitting in the library now understood something different. Punishment could change circumstances. It could not change the past. Evelyn folded the letter carefully. When Edmund asked whether she would reply, she looked toward the window. "I do not know if forgiveness is possible." Then she paused. "But I know bitterness cannot be the thing that guides the rest of my life." Edmund nodded. He had learned not to demand answers from her. That was another change. The man who once decided everything for her had finally learned the importance of allowing another person to choose. Years later, visitors to Ashcombe Manor would often hear different stories about the same woman. Some remembered the Duchess who had been publicly humiliated. Some remembered the scandal. Some remembered the night the truth was revealed. But those who knew Evelyn best remembered something simpler. They remembered a woman who walked through hardship without allowing it to make her cruel. They remembered a woman who returned not to prove others wrong, but to live according to her own values. The old diary remained in the library, not as a reminder of betrayal, not as a symbol of the pain she had endured. It remained there because every generation of Ashcombe should know what happened when silence was mistaken for loyalty and obedience was mistaken for virtue. On the final page, beneath the last words Evelyn had written, someone later added a simple note, not in accusation, not in anger, only in remembrance. She was never powerless. They only believed she was, and that was the truth. No storm, no rumor, and no closed door could ever take away. Yet even after years had passed, Evelyn knew that some stories did not disappear simply because justice had arrived. They remained in the memories of those who had lived through them. One autumn evening, a young solicitor arrived at Ashcombe Manor, carrying a collection of old estate papers. He had been reviewing documents from families connected to the surrounding villages and had discovered several references to disputes that had been settled quietly over the years. Among them was a record of a tenant family who had been removed from their cottage decades earlier, under circumstances that resembled what had happened to Evelyn. The young solicitor expected Evelyn to react with anger. Instead, she read the papers carefully. Then she asked one question: can anything still be done for them? The solicitor hesitated. The original decisions were made many years ago. Evelyn looked at the papers again. Then we begin with what can still be corrected. It was the same answer she had given herself when she first opened the diary after leaving Ashcombe. Not everything could be restored. Not every wound could be closed, but something could always be repaired. With Edmund's agreement, the estate began reviewing old arrangements with the village families. It was not announced as a grand act of generosity. Evelyn refused to allow another situation where powerful people received praise for correcting what should never have happened. She simply believed that responsibility should be carried quietly. The servants noticed the difference. The villagers noticed it too. And slowly, Ashcombe Manor became known not as the place where a duchess had been silenced, but as the place where old wrongs were finally being examined. One winter morning, Evelyn returned to the library alone. The room looked almost exactly as it had years before. The same shelves, the same fireplace, the same heavy wooden desk. But she was not the same woman who had searched this room while wondering whether she could trust anyone. She opened the drawer where the diary was kept. Beside it was the old key Mr. Hale had given her on the night she left. She held it for a moment. That small piece of metal had once represented desperation. Now it represented a turning point, a reminder that even when she believed she had lost everything, someone had believed her story deserved to be found. A knock came at the door. It was Edmund. He stopped when he saw the diary in her hands. "I often wondered whether you would ever forgive this house." Evelyn looked around the library. She considered the question carefully. Then she answered, "A house cannot be forgiven or blamed. People can." Edmund accepted the answer, because he understood now that Evelyn did not need to make the past smaller in order to move forward. She could acknowledge what happened without allowing it to define every day that followed. Years earlier, he had mistaken silence for peace. Now he understood that true peace required honesty first. That evening, Ashcombe Manor held another gathering, not a celebration of wealth, not a display of status, a gathering for the village families, the servants, and the people who had helped rebuild the connection between the estate and the community. The ballroom was filled again. The same room where Evelyn had once stood alone while people laughed. But this time, the laughter was different. It was not directed at someone suffering. It was shared among people who finally understood one another. Evelyn stood beneath the chandelier and looked across the room. She remembered the woman she had been on that terrible night. A woman who believed her life had ended because one door had closed. She wished she could speak to that woman. She would tell her that leaving was not the end, that losing a place could reveal a person's true strength, that sometimes the road away from home was the road back to oneself. Outside, winter winds moved through the gardens. Inside, the fire burned warmly. The contrast remained the same as always. Cold beyond the walls, warmth within. But now Evelyn understood that belonging was not created by being allowed inside. It was created by knowing that, wherever she stood, she carried her own worth with her. And when the final pages of the old diary were preserved among the Ashcombe records, no one called them the writings of a troubled duchess anymore. They were remembered as the words of a woman who endured injustice, searched for truth, and chose dignity over revenge. A woman who discovered that the greatest victory was not making others regret what they had done. It was becoming someone they could never break again. That lesson remained with Evelyn long after the final pages of her diary had been placed safely inside the Ashcombe records. One quiet evening, as the last guests departed and the candles in the ballroom burned lower, Evelyn walked through the empty room alone. The chairs had been moved back into place. The music had stopped. The voices had faded. But she could still remember the night this same room had taken everything from her. The difference was not the room. The difference was the woman standing inside it. She touched the edge of the table where Edmund had once placed her diary before the entire household. That object had once been used to define her. Now it belonged only to her, a record of what she had survived, a reminder of what she had learned. Behind her, the ballroom doors opened. Mrs. Whitmore entered carrying a small tray with a cup of tea. The old housekeeper smiled. You always come here when the house is quiet." Evelyn looked around, perhaps because this was the place where everything became clear. Mrs. Whitmore placed the tray down carefully. "And now?" Evelyn looked toward the windows. "Now I know that losing everything was not the end of my story." The old servant nodded, because she understood. Some victories were not announced in newspapers. Some victories did not require applause. Sometimes victory was simply waking each morning and knowing that no one else owned your future. Outside, the wind moved through the Ashcombe gardens. Inside, the fire continued to burn. And the woman who had once walked away from the manor in the middle of a storm now stood there by her own choice, surrounded, not by fear, but by peace. The house had changed, the family had changed, but most importantly, Evelyn had changed. She was no longer the Duchess who needed others to believe her. She was Evelyn Ashcombe, and that was enough.